Welcome. I guess I should issue different types of welcomes to our faculty and students. Welcome to the program. To our alumni, welcome back. And to our guests, welcome to the College of Architecture and Planning at Ball State University. In case it has escaped a notice of any of you here, this is the second event in celebration of our 25th silver anniversary year of the college. I'm pleased to note that we have a beautiful day for this program, a golden day for our silver anniversary, if you will. I think I should make note of the somewhat surreal roomscape that we find ourselves in. This was not produced or fabricated specifically for this occasion. It is the vestiges of the multimedia show that our polyarch students produced just a short time ago. They do a biennial field study tour of Europe, and they have decorated the space for that purpose. We left it up. I guess that was a good decision. It does impart some interesting character to the space. The centerpiece of today's activities is the panel discussion, which will begin shortly. The clock will start on that panel discussion when I leave the lecture, and so we'll have a full 2 hours to hear from the panel. Following the panel discussion, Jeff Hall will make a couple of announcements, and Tony Costello will make a couple of announcements about the rest of the day's activities, which include a buffet luncheon in the atrium. And after the buffet luncheon, we will adjourn, we hope, for our faculty and guests and alumni to discuss and review student work around the college. We all hope you'll participate. After that, there will be a reception at the Muncie Arts Center for faculty, alumni, and guests, which we hope will be well attended as well. I would invite everyone to take the opportunity to, if they haven't had the opportunity so far, to view the exhibit of alumni and faculty work that's predominantly in the exhibit space, but also is in other places in the college. Tony Costello, who is in the doorway there, and his colleagues have done an absolutely splendid job of putting together the exhibit. I find it most impressive. I can say that since I didn't have anything to do with putting it together. Today's panel discussion should be of special interest to us all for at least 3 reasons. First, the topic, the future issues and challenges that will face our professions of architecture, landscape architecture, and planning should be of special interest to us. If not, I think we're in the wrong business, if you will. Second, we are most honored to have as panelists the 3 presidents of the professional societies for architecture, landscape architecture, and planning. For us to hear them and for them to hear each other speak to the future of their respective professions is a unique occurrence, perhaps the only time this will happen this year. And third, the discussion will be moderated by the president of our university. The president's no stranger to the college, but we're especially pleased to have him here to participate in a college activity. And as they say, without further ado, It is with great pleasure that I now introduce our president, Dr. Johnny Worthen, for the introduction of the other members of our distinguished panel and the moderation of what I'm sure will be a lively and informative 2 hours. President Worthen.
Thank you very much, Dean Fisher. I'm delighted to participate in this silver anniversary celebration, and on behalf of the entire university, I bring congratulations to the College of Architecture and Planning. This college has been described by a number of people as the jewel in the Ball State crown, and that's for several good reasons. First of all, the college attracts outstanding students. Faculty are first rate, and they are absolutely committed to the learning that goes on among our students. Indeed, the faculty in this college are really models for what faculty ought to be in a university such as ours that holds the goal to be a premier teaching university. The accessibility of faculty to our students is a hallmark of this group of faculty members, and I'm again pleased to say that I'm here to bring you congratulations and greetings on this 25th anniversary. I want to thank and recognize Dean Robert Fisher, the founding dean of this college, Charles Sappenfield, and Associate Dean Jeff Hall, who really chaired the committee and put things together for this celebration, and bring greetings to all the faculty and students and particularly our guests from who have come to the campus from some distances. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel to help us celebrate this silver anniversary. Our topic is an agenda for the 90s, challenges to and directions of the environmental design and planning professions, and the imperatives for change in the professional education as we move into the 21st century. I'm going to introduce the panelists to you one at a time, and then they're going to make a presentation. Each will make a presentation, and then we're going to have a few minutes for the panel to comment, if they wish, on the presentations that have been made, and then we'll simply open it up to discussion and hear your questions and comments and have the panel respond, and hopefully have a lively and, as Dean Fisher said, an informative and productive discussion. Well, let's begin. I want to introduce first James Lawler, FAIA, President of the American Institute of Architects. To make the first presentation, the American Institute of Architects represents over 50,000 architects and intern architects. Mr. Lawler makes his living as head of C.J. Lawler Associates in West Hartford, Connecticut, an award-winning firm in the fields of education and energy design. He's a graduate of Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh. He served the AIA locally and nationally as vice president and board member. At the national level, he's chaired the Design Commission, the Architectural Research Council, the Public Education Steering Group, the Education Policy Task Group, and the Educational Guidelines Task Group. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce James Lawler, President of the American Institute of Architects. Lawler.
It's very nice for me to be here, and many of you may wonder by the end of this talk why I was asked to be here. A year and a half ago or 2 years ago, before I was elected president of the American Institute of Architects, nobody ever asked me to go anywhere to speak about anything. And the reason may be clear after we're done here, particularly in an academic community. I'm a practitioner from private practice. And every once in a while, when I do go to an academic community, I find out that the vocabulary is very different. I don't use paradigm, dichotomy, and pedagogy in my everyday vocabulary. And frequently, when two of those words come up in a sentence, I have great difficulty finding out what the sentence was. Before we sat down for the panel, we were discussing with the moderator what was going to happen today, and he is as uneasy as we all are to be up here, not knowing what to ask about architecture. And I related that 2 weeks ago I was at the Monterey Design Conference. I was on the final panel, sitting before 500 California architects, and everybody in California thinks they're different than everybody else in the country. And the topic was, will the real California architecture stand up? Well, I thought this is the kind of topic I could handle. It's a very easy subject. It can't be anything very intellectual to talk about that. I sat down in the panel, and the moderator immediately asked the question. I hadn't the slightest idea what she was asking. So I immediately looked over at the person on the far end of the panel, looking like that's the seat of all knowledge, and he obviously had to respond to the question. And I figured, by the time he gets done answering the question, I'm going to know what the question was. Not a chance. So I looked at the second person, and the second person answering, I haven't the slightest idea what he said either. So I spoke. I haven't the slightest idea what I said, but everybody afterwards said that it was right on the point. So we'll try to do that again today. And actually, Charlie gave me one topic of the talk today, and a couple of pieces of paper I received had 2 or 3 other topics. You heard 2 different topics announced from here today. So having no idea what we're supposed to talk about, but we'll all know afterward, if anybody listens, we can all talk about that afterward and find out what we really said. But if we are talking about the future of the profession and the future of education, or professional education, which is what Charlie mentioned to me first, I think first you have to have an idea of where I stand or what I think is the definition of architecture. What is architectural practice and what is the profession? I think it is artistic problem solving that has to add value to our environment. I'm not saying that's what it does, but I think that's what it has to do and it should do. And those of you who are students, that is the future of what you have to do. Those of you who are practitioners, we have to clear that up and we have to make sure that we clean up our act and do that. We have to take care of the painterly and the sculptural part of architecture, the art part. We have to take care of the technological part, resisting gravity, making sure that the only water that comes in through the building, into the building is through the pipes and not through the walls and the roof. We have to take care of those things. We also have to take care of the people that come to the buildings, whether they use them or don't. We create objects and internal and exterior spaces. One of the things that architecture is, as soon as you decided to study architecture, you took on one of the greatest responsibilities anybody can take on in this world. The challenges before you are never ending. We don't do things that are here today and gone tomorrow. It's not like this lecture. You know, an hour and a half, everybody, after we leave here, you're not going to remember what I said. But a building is supposed to last a long time. The number of people we touch, whether they ever enter your building or not, is enormous in the lifetime of that building. Everybody that drives down the street and has to be forced to look at what you've left on the landscape is affected by your building. Those that go inside and walk through the building and use it are affected by what we have done and what we've left behind. It's an incredible responsibility. We don't build for tomorrow. We are building the heritage that hopefully generations in the future will look back on and say, they did it right. Those are the examples we have to learn from. We don't want them to say, look at the mistakes made in the past, we've got to avoid those things. We want what we leave to be useful, to fit the programmatic needs, to have enough flexibility to meet changing times in the future, to be here not for years, not for decades, but hopefully we should be planning for centuries. That doesn't happen in the United States. It happens in Europe. You can go to Paris and find an apartment that's been rented for 400 years. It's a little tough to do in the United States. Some of us are designing buildings to be torn down, refaced, or refurbished in 5, 10, or 15, or 20 years. That is not what I think is the responsibility of architecture. We have the ability to create spaces, objects, interior and exterior spaces that affect people's lives. We can increase productivity. We can make people comfortable. We can make people uncomfortable. We have an enormous impact on life. We also have to take a look at what we do from the time we think about a building to the time it leaves its useful life. And hopefully that's a long time in the future. The impact we can have on this planet and the environment starts with thinking about the products we use, how they are mined, how they are refined, how they are manufactured, how they are erected, how they then exist in their useful state. Do they give off gases? Do they do all kinds of problems? And how are they disposed of in the end? What are the economics of that? What are the ecological effects of that? What are the environmental effects of that? Those aren't little things you're toying with when you decide you want to study architecture and become an architect. Doctors and surgeons have an enormous responsibility, one person at a time. You can affect cities. You can affect countries. You can affect an enormous number of people. If you just look at your liability, design one Hoosier Dome, and you find out what your liability is for affecting how many thousands of people in their lives in the structural capacity of that building. So when you start studying architecture and you take a look at the architectural program and how people practice architecture, when you leave school, you don't have to become a practicing architect in the traditional practice. But if you do, you don't have to be an architect that does everything. In architectural offices, you design, you write specifications, you do cost estimating, you do working drawings, you do contract administration for construction, you do marketing, you run the business. You can choose to do 1, 2, 3, or all of those. I happen to do all of those. I'm a sole proprietor with a very small firm. So I have chosen to do all of those. But that's not for everybody. And you shouldn't feel different about not wanting to do all of those things. But you have to have, when you're in school and when you're in practice, a continuing knowledge and a continuing education of all of those things. Because if you are not the whole team, and even if you are not the leader of the team, you have to be able to converse and work with everybody else to create whole architecture. And by whole architecture, I mean architecture that responds to all of the psychological and the social and the physical needs that our programs have and the community has around them. You also have to have knowledge and understanding of the people that we work with. Fortunately, we have an integrated panel of different parts of the building and the planning profession to work with, because that is critical. When you're in school, you take engineering courses. Most of us are not expected to design structural systems for our buildings. But when you do a conceptual design, you better darn well have in your mind the idea from program, code, your spatial needs, and what you want to see, what kind of structural system you're going to have. You ought to be able to go to your structural engineer later on and tell them you want it to be cast in place concrete, or you want it to be steel. Or you can make the detail go as far as Mies van der Rohe did. Or if you go to Helmut Jahn's United Terminal at O'Hare, the integration of architecture, of structure, and of mechanical and electrical equipment at O'Hare is phenomenal for today's architecture, something that you really ought to go see. It takes a lot of knowledge of everything that everybody else does in order to put that together and to make it work. One of the things we are lacking in architecture today, and fortunately from the very inception of your program 25 years ago here at Ball State, urban design has been an important part of your program. Learning to communicate with the community and learning to integrate urban design and architecture and speak of them together is important. In most schools in the country, that was big in the 60s, and it's gone. It's very, very important that it's here. It's very important that we have landscape architect and a planner on this panel. Buildings do not stand alone. We as architects should not design buildings to be pieces or objects in the center of a piece of property and expect the streets and the property lines to define what goes on outside. What we do should prepare for the person who builds next to us. What we do should prepare for what should take care of what's been there before. One of the nice things about visiting Charlie's house last night, Charlie's house is a house in a regular residential neighborhood. Most houses in residential neighborhoods are plopped in the middle of the lot, and that's it. You take care of landscaping and you mow the lawn around the perimeter. Charlie's house, you are immediately aware of a sense of entry, a progression of where you go, and a definition of exterior space, because Charlie has used his garage, the entry portico, and the house to create an interior-exterior space that's in the part of that lot. That doesn't happen very often, but it is the kind of integration that every architect should consider. Interior space, exterior space, and the coordination you need. Property lines and curbs do not define exterior space. Buildings, moundings, plantings do. Working with landscape architects and planners to understand the aims, both the economic, sociological needs of a neighborhood, and taking advantage of the site are important things. If you can hear me, y'all? One of the things I want to share with you is I went to a session once called the Signature Roundtable. Joe Esrick and one of his partners, Ray and Gunn, Watney, and a few other people were at this meeting. They were all asked to go to the board and show how they approach architecture. Do a organization chart of how your office attacks projects. That's what everybody did. Whether it's client, principal, part of the firm, project architect, the job admin, landscape architect, that's what they did, except for one person. Go ahead, sure. He started writing names all around the outside. Joe Asher was asked to explain what he did. He said, well, this is the project, this is the program, this is the objective we're working on. This is my landscape architects, clients, local users, mechanical engineers. We all get together to focus on the problem, to focus on the program, to bring resolution to the problem. Everybody else said, oh yeah, that's really the way it works. Well, yeah. Maybe it's the way we all like it. But I think that's the way we as architects should think about projects in our office. That's the way when you look at a program laid out for you for 5 years. You shouldn't be looking at these as individual courses or hurdles that you have to jump over. You should be looking at these as the information that you have to put together in your head to be reactionary to the design, to the programmatic needs of the people that you're going to serve. You cannot do that alone. And one of the things you never remember learning in school, and it takes you a long time to learn outside, is that you can't do architecture without clients unless you come to the profession incredibly well. Now, there are a few people that come out of Yale and Harvard that go in and are wanting to come out and do those kinds of things. And in New England, we frequently see them getting better program projects than we did before they graduated. But for the most of us, we depend on clients. But that means that you have an even greater responsibility than just the responsibility to deal with those things that happen in the profession. Because you have the responsibility to educate the public that uses your building, the people that make the demands on you for your program, the people that pay you for that project and come up and make a lot of the decisions. You have to add them to your circle. You have to work together so they realize the values that are inculcated in that particular, in our profession, and what needs to be put together to perform a properly functioning building that's successful into the future. If we look into the future, the American Institute of Architects came up with a program called Vision 2000. Vision 2000 put together a whole bunch of people from all walks of life to sit down and go over what they thought the big events and the challenges that would be facing America in the future would be, and architecture in particular. And the 4 top ones that came out of that were a global economy. We have to learn to be able to work in a global economy. We have to understand political systems. We have to understand monetary systems. We have to know the difference between metric and the English system. We have to know a lot of those things. But one of the very important things we have to know is we have to know what sociologists and anthropologists and psychologists know. We have to know about the differences in people. We have to know, if you were to read books by Edward T. Hall, The Silent Dimension, or The Hidden Dimension, mentioned in silent language, that we aren't all the same. People in the United States space themselves at bus stops. People in other cultures, if there's nothing around, will be standing in groups so they're almost touching each other. Conversational distances are different. Things that we do in private are things that people do in public other places because they're offended if you go and hide from them. Those kinds of things have enormous ramifications in architectural design. And you have to know them if we prepare ourselves for a global market. Everybody is not like us, thank God. And everybody is different, and we have to respond to that with our architecture. Another challenge is technology, the growing technology that we have in buildings. And everybody has to understand the growing technology and how things are changing in communication, how we change heating and lighting systems, energy requirements. We have to know how to resolve the problems of our cities as another challenge. How do we take care of refurbishing, rebuilding the dying urban centers of our country? That's for the older cities. How do we take care of the design of those things that developers are building at the intersections and the nodes of our highway systems that are sometimes deadlier than the cities that we've abandoned? How do we take care of the design, the planning criteria for those particular areas? And the fourth challenge is how do we take care of the changing value structure in the United States? The changing of our population from a younger population to an older population, to a difference in mobility, a difference in economic needs. Those are all architectural issues. And if you're a good architect, you respond to them all. When you take a look at the space, I'm very happy that the sheets didn't come down. One thing that an architect has to know when he designs a space like this is how is the lighting going to affect people? Not only how many watts is it going to use or what is the lighting level that's going to be there, how do people react to it? How do people react to the acoustics? How do people react to the dimensions in the space? You don't design a space like this by the elevations. If I were to look at the elevations on this, I'd say somebody studied it. You know, we've got the block coursing in the concrete frame and the windows and everything all worked out, and somebody's been very careful about that. But I have a feeling that if I were in here without the sheets, patches or no patches, the acoustics would be very different, and I was told that they were. They probably still could be a little bit better. And the lighting would be very harsh, because as I look at you in the back, I'm very happy that I'm here under kind of a soft light, even though you're back then. I feel a little sorry for you, but there's a couple seats up here. But you have to integrate that understanding into your design. The color light gives, the brightness light gives. If you were to design every room when you get out into an office later by the IES standards, you would find you'd be creating people with a lot of tension. You have to know the difference between direct and indirect light. You have to know that maybe where IES standards say 100-foot candles or 120, that maybe 59 at an indirect level is really very, very comfortable. You got to take a light meter out, and you have to learn between now and when you do your first building what the experience is of different lighting levels. You have to understand how people react to those kinds of things. It's very, very important. Architecture is a whole art. There are a lot of challenges facing us in the future. You have to not be an expert in all of them, but you have to take conversational engineering, conversational landscape architecture, conversational planning. You better damn well know the impact that everything that we do as an object in space affects everything around it. You have to understand the creation of space, both interior and exterior, and you have to be designing so that the buildings we leave behind in the future are those that generations look back on and try to emulate or learn from, the ones that people visit when they come visit our country a century from now. Not the ones that we say, geez, you better not do that, or the slide that comes up in design class, or the trip that the teacher took to show you what not to do, or the horrendous, uncomfortable spaces. But designing today the heritage for tomorrow in a whole architecture that understands our responsibility. Your responsibility starts when you made the choice. It doesn't end when you stop architecture, because you ought to become an activist. You have to take part in the political and the social systems. The best president of our United States, in my opinion, happened to have been the only one that was an architect. When you leave here, you may not be an architect. You may become a developer, decision maker, investor, facilities manager. There's a whole bunch of ways that you can have an enormous impact in the built environment and the natural environment in this country with your architectural education. Because the education that you get in the design studio, decision-making processes and artistically solving problems, meeting the technological needs and the programmatic needs of society, can serve you well as a decision maker in an enormous number of things. Remember that, and you should do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lawler. You've gotten us off in an excellent manner. Let me now introduce to you Claire Richardson Bennett, FASLA, President of the American Society of Landscape Architects. The American Society of Landscape Architects represents over 10,000 professionals and she serves as a director of the Landscape Architecture Foundation. Claire was graduated from Radcliffe College and attended the Harvard Graduate School of Design. She's maintained her own firm to practice landscape architecture in Indianapolis for the past 16 years. She's the mother of 4 and grandmother of 3. She was the first woman elected to the presidency of any Harvard club, and she has served as board member and officer for both Harvard and Radcliffe College Alumni Associations. Join me in welcoming Claire Richardson Bennett.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you. I have to apologize. I'm not that comfortable with the microphone. I'm much happier to have a drafting pencil in my hand. But as elected officer of this organization, there's a certain amount of public speaking that I guess you have to deal with. I suspect that perhaps due to my age, as I look through this audience here, that I was one of the few, except for Charlie and a small number of others, who were here at the time this college was founded. I remember coming to Muncie for some special inaugural kinds of things. And it certainly has grown, and its reputation has nurtured and to a level where it's really a highly respected university nationwide and internationally as well. I never dreamed 25 years ago that I would be standing at the microphone addressing this audience, but here I am, and talking to you about landscape architecture and the profession and how it deals with the future. As I think about it, it kind of follows the season. Right now, I see the trees outside just bursting. They just want to release that energy and get those blossoms out in full bloom. And that's really how I see the landscape architecture profession today. The roots have been planted, the seeds are there, the growth has started. We're just blossoming out now, and there's such a future in terms of the spread and the growth that we have in front of us. It's certainly an expanding profession. We've multiplied our numbers in the last 25 years unbelievably. And, but along with that, the interests have changed. 10 years ago, the graduating landscape architect had courses and dealt with urban design issues, with historic landscape preservation, with parks and recreation, campus planning, things of that nature. Now, the emphasis is more on wastewater management, the protection of wildlife habitats. They are dealing with wetland mitigation and land management planning. There are many, many issues that have come to this profession, or that this profession has grown into beyond what existed 10 years ago. More and more we find that our landscape architects are working in government agencies, many with the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, the Forest Service. They're working for the fishery and wildlife segments. They're really involved in many, many of the environmental issues. Now, as we look to the future of the environmental concerns, they're not going to subside. They're just going to grow substantially larger. And we have to acknowledge our imposition upon this planet and what we have done and what we need to address in order to correct it, in order to preserve it, and what we can do in the future. What this does is present a major question in terms of the education of landscape architects and how a university deals with a profession that's growing so fast. It's not just the technology, which we're all three of our professions are dealing with, but how do we prepare professionals with only so many hours that they have of a student's time in so many years? There's no way that they can cover all of these things. So I see education in the future as being one of our main concerns. It's something that can only be addressed through continuing education. And how we deal with that is something that hasn't yet been defined in terms of landscape architecture. It's something that our society is trying to address for the benefit of the profession. There's so many questions about whether this kind of thing becomes voluntary or mandatory, how it affects the state registration laws, and we now have registration in, I believe, 47 states. How there's just many, how the whole system is monitored becomes a thing, whether the registration group, the national, ours is called CLARB, whether they monitor it. But for our own protection as a profession, we really do need to make sure that all of our practitioners are continuing their education. And many will argue that they're learning every day as they work on the boards or as they deal with clients, but there's something beyond that, and many things beyond that we need to educate ourselves on. Another major concern that I see in the future is leadership. Many landscape architects tend to be, by nature, non-aggressive, as opposed to perhaps architects. In order to effect changes in legislation and take political action to create the things that we are concerned about and address the issues of environmental concern, we need to be more aggressive. And so I think we need to, as a profession, try to find ways to identify the people who have that potential, to expand on that so that we can become a leading force in creating new regulation and new things that will be helpful for our profession and for the world at large. Now, the third item that I would like to talk about is cooperation, because this is, I think, fundamental, essential, vital. Every other word that you can find that describes cooperation in terms of the environment. If I can digress for just a minute, I think I've tried to analyze, how we got to the point that we are, and everybody's minding over their own turf, and we're not always working together for the betterment of the world in which we live. And if you think back, a lot of you are like myself. You grew up with what I call the ego excel ethnic. I was taught that I could do anything that I set my mind to do. And I went about doing that. And over many years of my life, this was very good for me. I had lots of opportunities. I grabbed them when I could. I've had a very full and rich life. And I'm just being personal here for a moment, but some years ago, all of a sudden, hi John, I just saw you back there. All of a sudden, life dealt me a blow that I wasn't prepared for. And I struggled with it, and I thought, I can overcome. I have the strength to meet this. Well, I didn't have the strength. And all of a sudden, I recognized that I needed people. I needed family. I needed friends. And then it made me realize that the problems that we deal with in the world are the same way, whether it be the drug problems, whether it be the economy of the nation, whether it be the Middle East crisis. Not any one of us, whether it be an individual or an organization or a state or a nation, can deal with today's problems alone. We've got to do it as a body. We've got to do it together. We've got to respect each other and understand each other and attack the problems of the world. I am hoping, when we look at the global situation, that this is something that we can encourage, that we can work toward in the future, because the problems of the ozone, the warming of the planet, the acid rain, the cutting of the rainforest, all of those things are things that we've got to do together. And we can't work together if we don't respect each other's level of expertise. We've got to work with architects, we've got to work with planners, we've got to work with hydrologists, we've got to work with conservationists. It's an army of people that have to overcome our problems. And those are the things that are critical today, and those are the things that we have to address. If I could return to that simple analogy that I made earlier about myself, and I was talking, I guess I kind of missed, because I wanted to mention to you how we all start as children and are complimented on our grades. We build in our lifestyles this, your grades are good, you've got to win, you've got to lead, you've got to be ahead, whether it's the NCAA or whether it's the Little League or whether it's in first grade, we put this emphasis on achievement and winning. And I'm not sure that we aren't missing something. I think that maybe we need to go back to that elementary school level and get the teachers to, in addition to this kind of winning spirit, to emphasize the achievements that can be done through cooperative efforts. And so this kind of thing is what I'm trying to underscore. And beginning with the children, make them realize that positive values and families and everybody have to deal with this kind of thing. Positive values can come out of cooperative efforts. I applaud Ball State for their encouraging cooperative projects within the disciplines here at the college. This is the kind of fundamental that helps meet tomorrow's challenges. And I'm happy to report that within our organizations, we have developed at the national level some interrelationship things. As a group, the architects, the planners, the engineers are all meeting under a title of Interprofessional Council of Education. And we're developing materials to make available to teachers in schools from first grade through 8th grade that might deal with an awareness of environmental design, so that the teacher can make the child aware that the architect is what's had caused this to happen, and the landscape architect has done something with the playgrounds, and how it all interrelates. And so as a group, we're working together to try to attack some of these problems. It's also a problem of minority recruitment, which I think this group will be addressing in the future. My concern is how we get it from the national level down to the regional level and the state level, and get all of the architects and engineers and planners working together for the betterment of our society. I'd like to just just end, I don't know how close I am to my time, but with congratulating the university and what they've done in the last 20 years and with the promise of what the next 25 years will hold, but also to quote something that our executive director wrote recently about landscape architects' needs for tomorrow. And he says, they need to be respectful of nature's legacy, open to change, free to challenge and experiment, gladly bound by an ethic of preservation. These attributes enable landscape architects to connect our values to the land, to infuse our environment with meaningful design spaces, and in spaces great and small, to lift the human spirit with the hope of affirmation and the possibility of renewal. Landscape architecture is a profession for the environment and for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Our next panelist is Stuart Meck, AICP, President of the American Planning Association. The American Planning Association represents 27,000 practicing planners, government officials, and citizens who are interested in planning. Mr. Meck holds degrees in journalism and in city planning from The Ohio State University and an MBA from Wright State University. Stuart is Assistant City Manager and Planning Director of Oxford, Ohio. We won't hold that against him if he's somewhere close to Miami University. He's taught planning at Ohio State, the University of Dayton, and Wright State University, and he currently teaches public administration and organizational theory and behavior in the Department of Political Science at Miami University in Oxford. Mr. Stuart Meck, President of the American Planning Association.
Thought I'd start by saying, since this is a College of Architecture and Planning, that I live in a house that was designed by an architect, and I'm an amateur landscape architect, and am heavily in debt to Jackson and Perkins, the rose growers. I'd like to approach this a little differently, perhaps look at our subject laterally rather than vertically. And let me begin by telling you a story of my first job. When I graduated from school, planning school at Ohio State University in 1971, I joined the Memphis and Shelby County Planning Commission in Memphis, Tennessee. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Memphis, but Memphis was a city that had gotten into planning early. Harlan Bartholomew, who was one of our profession's pioneers, completed one of his first city plans for Memphis in 1924. And Memphis had a tradition of lush parks, which were done in the City Beautiful style. There was also a beautiful parkway that ringed the mature areas of the city. The Joint Commission for whom I worked, this was a city-county agency, employed an executive director whose appointment was subject to the confirmation of the city and the county legislative bodies, the city and county executives, and the Planning Commission itself. The staff numbered about 40. There were 19 professional staff members. We were all young, we were all under 30. Most of us had master's degrees in planning or related fields. We even had some architects on the staff at the time. We occupied a half floor in the Memphis City Hall in a city-county civic center complex. Very spacious and well-lit offices. I had the best office I ever had, expansive view of the Mississippi River. In the spring, when the Mississippi flooded, you could see it flood as far back as the horizon. And the budget was pretty good. At no time in my life since, and even when I controlled my own budget, have I had such a cornucopia of Prismacolor markers and pencils. You know, those are about, I think, $2.50 a piece these days, so I only get them in the basic colors. The Planning Commission members themselves were nice people. They were superficially the kind of people you'd enjoy having a drink with, or mid-julep at the country club. The city appointees tended to be wealthy or prominent men, businessmen in the community, or members of old planter families. The county appointees tended to be builders and developers and real estate brokers. There were no community activists as such, and few, if any, minorities on the boards and commissions in Memphis. By any traditional test, the Memphis and Shelby County Planning Commission, where I worked, should have been a highly effective planning organization. It had trained professional staff and adequate resources, and it didn't have to deal with the multiplicity of governmental units that makes planning difficult in other communities. The commission members themselves, drawn from the creme de la creme of Memphis, should have been influential in shaping public opinion on development issues. They should have been people whose views were respected by elected officials and sought by elected officials. And yet it wasn't. From almost the first day that I arrived, I sensed that there was something wrong. The executive director's biennial reappointment was held up by the county for the second time because they didn't like what he was recommending. The commission members, I learned later, did not like the staff reports on development issues to be made public. Instead, they preferred to receive them in private where they could decide individual cases on their merits. Every once in a while, the Memphis City Council would get curious about what the staff was recommending. Obviously, they were paying them money to make professional recommendations, but the Memphis and Shelby County Planning Commission members balked at releasing staff recommendations because they didn't want to be brought into a conflict where the staff reports contradicted, as they often did, the strange recommendations that were coming out of the Planning Commission. Long-range planning itself had floundered. That's what we were brought there for. There had been a series of planning district studies initiated, a classic approach, divide the city up into districts, prepare plans for those districts. They kept going through a variety of drafts. The commission wasn't particularly interested in accelerating those plans to the public hearing stage. And of course, the commission wasn't terribly interested in citizen participation or in social issues, which was strange because in the 70s, the city of Memphis was a cauldron bubbling with all sorts of social issues, and yet we seemed to be avoiding them or pretending they weren't there. The year after I started, the executive director who had hired me, a fine man, still a friend of mine, resigned to join a mortgage banking firm, which was some sort of an omen. One of his deputies, after a national search, replaced him. And gradually I came to the conclusion, painful as it was and idealistic as I suppose I was then, that while there was planning to be done in Memphis and Shelby County, nobody had any expectations of the Planning Commission staff or the Planning Commission, in fact, doing it. And despite a promotion, I left the following year for a planning job in the north, in Dayton. And almost the entire professional staff turned over within 2 years of my departure. Something was wrong. The city had a chief administrative officer, and he too was frustrated over the commission staff's ability to produce reports timely and addressing problems that he thought needed to be addressed. So he set up a separate organization, a policy planning and analysis bureau, to administer the then new Community Development Block Grant Program. This was 1974. The City Council went ahead and created a separate Center City Commission to plan and implement development projects inside the parkways in the mature area of the city. This was a very disquieting experience, and I mention it today because half the audience, I suppose, are students, and you're going to go to your first job, and you're going to have your idealism and your expectations sort of smashed to the pavement. Doesn't always happen. It took me a long time to rationalize. Why wasn't the planning process and this planning commission effective, which is going to be my theme today? I kept asking myself that. And apparently it occurred to the commission itself because they hired the American Society of Planning Officials, which was one of the predecessor organizations of the APA, to come in and undertake a management study. And they did. They completed a management study in May 1975 and went back to read it, preparing for this. And the commission, the ASPO concluded, this is right out of the report, has not been in a very effective forum for identifying and resolving growth management issues facing city and county government. In part, its organizational structure has hampered it in dealing decisively with development issues in both governments. And the report went on to criticize almost everything about this commission. The organization structure distanced it from the center of governmental decision-making. The commission had failed to undertake long-range planning, which was its mission. It had failed to provide leadership. And the resulting land development administration system, this report said, was unwieldy and inefficient, and was possibly laced with conflict of interest as well. And the management study recommended a series of measures to restructure the agency and improve its internal operations. Many were carried out. New staff members were brought in. Some people took early retirement. I used the Memphis and Shelby County Planning Commission, which no longer exists, thank God, in the form I remember it, not as an example of virtue restored. If we go out and study something, we know how to make changes, but rather an example of what I call the old culture of planning, which is a culture of which we are becoming increasingly intolerant. If you read books like In Search of Excellence and Corporate Cultures, you know that in management theory, which is what I teach on a part-time basis, so you're going to get a 5-minute course in it, there's this theory that the job of the leaders of organizations is to figure out what kind of culture that organization is existing in and to try and shape the organization to respond to that. The way I can describe culture to you is perhaps a conceptual lens, a way of looking at the world, of viewing the world, a set of actions, a set of basic beliefs and assumptions, standard operating procedures that a profession or an organization develops as it interacts with its external environment. And the argument that I'm going to make to you this morning is that there are a number of major trends occurring in planning, and I think development and design in the United States, and they are the result of two different cultures of planning. Perhaps to summarize this, there is an old culture of planning which came out of the government reform movement of the 1920s. American city planning really came out of a period, late 1910s, the teens and the 20s, when there was incredible emphasis on reform of government. American city planning came out of the same movement that produced the settlement house movement, the same movement that produced a city manager form of government. And that is the old culture. All right, that's the old culture. I'm going to describe that in a moment. It's my contention that there is another culture, a culture that has appeared in American city planning over the past 15 to 20 years, one which is more action-oriented, one which emphasizes producing results now, one which involves planners and the public in envisioning a future and taking steps to bring about that future. What I'm going to do is, I contend there are basically 4 set of assumptions in this dichotomy. And when you teach management theory, you teach about organizations, a good way to teach about them is to set up 2, I'm going to use this word, paradigms, or 2 models, because that's really what I'm trying to do here. And you use these to stimulate discussion. People who, I'm sure those of you who teach know what I mean. The old culture's assumption, can you all see this? Everyone see it? Okay. I went in here and I scoped the room out to make sure everybody could. The old culture, first of all, believed that elected officials can't be trusted to plan. If you look at our structure of planning in the United States, it removed from direct control the institutions of planning. It created the tradition of the Advisory Planning Commission. Planning was thought to be above politics, And planning was supposed to be done by the best people, all right? Like in Memphis, the best people. In the new culture, the culture that I see as emerging in the practice of planning, we believe, and I call this the new pragmatism, by the way. That's my term for it, because it's very much pragmatic. We believe now that planning should embrace politics rather than reject it. That planning solutions are, in fact, in real life, brokered and negotiated and compromised among interest groups. There isn't one group out there that has a monopoly on defining the public interest. The public interest is produced by this churning and this bargaining and this compromising, and that's what produces planning solutions that actually get implemented. My second point, and I suppose this will raise some eyebrows here, is if you look at the history of the American city planning profession, you see this term coming up time and time again, environmental or physical determinism. The old culture had a strong belief in environmental or physical determinism, the notion that one's behavior is shaped by one's physical surroundings, and that is an architectonic view of the world. It is the city beautiful revisited. The notion that if you provide parkways and if you provide civic centers and you provide long sinuous boulevards and statuary, that type of city will induce civic pride and moral uplift in individuals. And therefore the plan or the implementation of the plan is seen as a source of moral uplift and civic pride. The old culture, because it was concerned with assimilating immigrants into the mainstream of American life, was very much concerned with the notion of physical order begetting social order. Well, I don't think we believe that to the extent that we used to. Now we see a movement in which planners, and I think architects and landscape architects, at least that's my belief about it, value the small scale and the intimate over the monumental and complex. We don't see physical design as an end in itself. There's been a great rebirth in interest in American city planning in neo-traditionalism, a return to early town forms, the gridiron pattern.
Management theory and Tom Peters' In Search of Excellence, which I think is one of the most important things about our responsibility, listening to people no matter what profession we're in, finding out really what the needs they have are, and meeting those needs with excellent product, service, whatever. We really have to do that. One of the other things that came to mind when I was talking and now when they were talking was the power that we have as architects, landscape architects, and urban designers. And if you don't think we have power, take a walk through Myling's Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. and tell me afterward that that very, very, very simple concept doesn't have an enormous amount of power. We all have that power, whether it is landscape design, whether it is urban design, whether it is architecture. It is a power that you have to use carefully and you have to use very, very positively. And to do that, one of the things you have to do is you have to continue throughout your life to catalog all of your experiences. And right now, start to think back when you were real small. and your parents took you to the first basketball game in a large coliseum. You're 3 and 4 or 5 years old and you walk in. Remember how tightly you grabbed your parents' hand as the space got bigger and the crowds got noisier? Remember that reaction. Remember how nice it was when somebody brought home a carton from the refrigerator or from a new stove that they bought, and that became an environmental space that was your size and you enjoyed it for weeks. Remember hiding behind the rhododendron in the front yard and what a beautiful experience that could have been, and the need for privacy and the need for environmental space. Remember all of those things. And I think one thing that I would like to leave as the last, in putting all of that kind of stuff together, my wife would be very disappointed if I didn't mention Jonathan Livingston Seagull, because she never wants to hear it again. But if have any of you read Jonathan Livingston Seagull? Well, I'll wait for the rest of you. It'll take you about an hour. We'll be here when you come back. But it's an important book to read. I don't care what you do in life. Jonathan Livingston Seagull is a seagull who does not go out and follow the fishing fleet and fight with the other seagulls for fish heads behind trawlers. He does not go and scavenge the dumps on shore for food. Jonathan Livingston Seagull, every living moment of his life, is trying to fly higher, trying to fly faster, trying to fly smoother, trying to fly slower. Whatever he tries to do the best that he can do over and over and over again, and always tries to push the level of excellence further and further and further. That's one of his great attributes. His second great attribute is an attribute shared by the latest 3 gold medalists that AIA has given out: Charles Moore, Joe Esherick, and Faye Jones. And that is the desire to pass that excellence on and to share it with everybody else. Jonathan Livingston Seagull spends the rest of his time trying to get the rest of the flock to experience the exaltation he has when he accomplishes something like that. It's what Faye Jones, Charles Moore, and Joe Esherick have been doing all of their architectural careers and continue to do now. It's something every one of us should do, no matter what walk of life we are. But there better be a little Jonathan Livingston Seagull in all of us, and the more, the better.
Claire or
I would just like to thank Jim for saying that, because I believe that so totally, and I think he very articulately stated a thought that probably we all carry, and we just need to be reminded of it every once in a while.
I was thinking of your comment about cooperation and that balance between cooperation and striving to be the best and to win. Those are difficult values to hold together and to work effectively together.
That's right. You can't sacrifice one for the other, because they both have their positive attributes. And it's just that I think in our culture so far, we have put more emphasis on the individual accomplishment and not enough on the cooperative accomplishments.
Yeah, I had 2 comments I wanted to make, particularly focusing on some things that Claire had said.
Can you hear?
Can you hear me?
You have to get closer to that, maybe.
Let's see. Yeah, that's better. If there are perhaps 2 trends that I see really affecting the design professions over the past 20 years, any trend, these are the ones that really strike me as being important, is the first one is the notion of land as a resource rather than a commodity. What is happening, I think, in the United States over the past, I'd say 20 years, is we are drawing away from the late 19th century notion that the only purpose of land we use is to make money. When I was young, I'm certain my parents had wetland as I did when I was young. I'm certain my parents still look at a wetland and say, well, that's a swamp. You got to fill that in, because it's no good. And now we look at wetlands value that have a complex web actually measure that have to take steps to preserve it. We also see that I think I find this which is dates from 1809 of any size these days. Almost every small town, it seems, of any size these days, or of any significant. Almost every small town, it seems, of any size these days, or of any significance these days, has some type of design review board. Now they function. Some of them function well. Some of them are run like garage sales, but nonetheless, we have changed in the view of the built environment. The old buildings are seen as, it used to be many centuries, old buildings are seen as having value. It used to be that we saw an old building, and if it was run down, we tear it down. Now we see an old building, and we look at a swamp and see value there. We look at an old building and we say, well, that old building connects us with the past. It provides a familiar orientation in our community. So we're going to take steps to keep that old building around, because that reminds us where we've come from. The second thing that I think that's really struck me in planning practice is the intense competition for the social use of land. We now not only do we see land as a resource as well as a commodity, but we realize that by our control of the use of land, we can affect or retard opportunities. A big movement in American city planning has been tried to make sure that housing that is built in suburban areas, particularly on the East Coast, remains affordable, which is something that many towns resist doing. Another big issue in American city planning today is opening up communities for the mentally and physically disabled. In 1988, the federal government passed the Federal Fair Housing Act amendment, and it makes local governments and builders and developers have a federal statutory obligation to eliminate barriers for the mentally and physically handicapped, not only in buildings, but also in zoning regulations that define relations among family members. We want to have a system of land use regulation that gives the mentally and physically disabled opportunities to live together in a family-like environment. So those are two trends that I have seen influencing the practice of planning and indeed the design professions over the past 20 years.
Thanks again to the panelists for those stimulating remarks. Let us now open the discussion to you. Why don't you rise? I'll try to recognize you, and if you want to address it to the whole panel, fine, or if you want to address your questions to an individual, just do so. Yes.
Unfortunately, I think our audacity has grown considerably. I think the problems normally arise over territorial disputes, kind of whose trees or who's in the woods, and we all kind of, as we set up organizations and associations, we have activities and we all begin to define territories. And then after we get all filled up with the activities in our territories, all of a sudden there's nothing to do, so we begin to look at expanding our territories or protecting our territories from other people. And I think that's the wrong attitude to take when you look at design. I think as we look at if we look at things not from a political or an economic point of view, but we look at things from a design point of view, we can realize that very few of us can accomplish alone what we can accomplish together in concert with other people. We cannot possibly have the information, the knowledge, the sensitivity, and the time to do all of the things really well ourselves. And we need to take those people who work together with us to produce something much, much better than we could alone. And it's not a political realization, it's not an economical and organizational one. It is one that goes back to, I think, a very, very basic design philosophy and a value for what we do. And the higher value you place on that, the more you're willing to open it up and make it better than it could be if you hugged onto it all by yourself.
Claire?
I might also mention in a more finite way that beyond the interprofessional council that I mentioned, that we made history last year when the executive committee of the AIA sat with the executive committee of the ASLA for a joint session. And I have been invited to be at the annual meeting for the AIA. I've been invited to speak to their board. I've been invited to speak to the Consulting Engineers Council. So I think steps are being developed, and there's a future for the coordination and cooperation of all these groups.
I think the one at a college, I suppose the best thing I could say is the way you get the design professions to work together is to start out when they're in undergraduate or graduate school through studios. When I went to Ohio State, probably the most interesting thing that I ever did was work on a design project. In fact, it was a course in landscape architecture, as it turned out, with architecture students and landscape architecture students. And you find out what other people know, or at least what they should know. That created a set of habits for me that have carried me through the rest of my life. I know when I'm running up against my limitations in terms of physical design, and will call on architects or landscape architects when I have a problem that I think calls for another perspective. I think that's really what a good graduate or undergraduate education ought to do, is give you a sense of when you need to bring in some assistance. I find in working with other design professionals, I work in a town where we have an architecture school, and a lot of houses in the city have been designed by architects, including my own. And I find having architects, landscape architects around just to show up at meetings and make the city council and planning commission nervous to be pretty refreshing. And I think we need that kind of stimulus, but you really have to create those habits early on. I probably could go on at length about my own personal feelings about licensing or registration. I think that at least licensing itself works against that kind of design cooperation by every time you get together and try to do a licensing statute, people spend a lot of time trying to define what the practice of this is, what the practice of that is. I think that the licensing statutes really get in the way of that and create a lot of turf problems that really seem to me to be irrelevant today.
I think the point you're making to bring the students of the three disciplines together is exactly what we're doing in this college, if I'm correct. Yes, right here.
that's one that is the battle between practitioners and educators. It's a very real one. It still exists. It's your old culture versus new culture. But if that term is correct, and I believe that it is, and somehow practitioners have been struggling to find where they need to go, how they need to learn, continue never had catching up because there has got to be a good relationship somehow. And I'd like to have perhaps talk about that a little bit because now very often it's more. I would say that my knowledge of this is somewhat different, maybe somewhat unique. I have an awful lot of practitioners all the time. And then maybe attempt to put this university now perhaps a model.
I've heard some suggestions made that the universities might address finding ways where practitioners could replace, at least to some extent, their salary for a period of a year or that, and come and lecture, but at the same time take courses so that they would have the opportunity to learn as well as to teach, and they wouldn't be losing a year's salary, for example, within their office status. That might be one opportunity to do that, because we do need to come closer together. There's a very broad gap between the educators and the practitioners.
Actually, with the economy across the country, it might be a good way to keep food on the tables for a lot of practitioners, depending on where they are. But it goes both ways. I mean, the complaint frequently from the practitioner side is that people who graduate from schools are not ready to take on the full responsibilities in an office. You shouldn't be. There are things that you should learn after graduation in an office that you can only learn in an office, because if you extended the school period to take all of that time to learn it, you'd never leave here. You'd never get out into practice. So that transition time and what is responsibility of practitioners to teach when you get out and come to work in an office is extremely important. Every office should be a learning environment, not as intense a learning environment as you have here, but it should be a learning environment, and all of us should be learning there all of the time. One of the things that practitioners need to do to come back to school once in a while is to make sure that the first building they do of a building type isn't the best, because they put a lot of research and thought, and all the rest of them are variations of what they pulled out of the drawer. They need to have a little mind expanding, a little opening up, a little loosening up, and that happens best in the academic community. So it's an enormous, I hope the tension shouldn't be there. What we should really have is a much greater partnership of the academic community and the professional community, because that's what's going to move the profession forward.
I have one comment on that. Again, working as I do in a university town, I pick up, emanating from the university, some of the intrigues that go on. And the thing that always fascinates me is who gets promotion and who gets tenure. And from what I can see, at least in most universities, that the emphasis on scholarship, which of course you'd hope would be there, has supplanted, I think to some degree, number one, the need to be a good teacher, and number two, the need to encourage members of faculties to remain active in professional organizations. And I'm not talking about professional academic organizations, but I'm talking about like being a member of the AIA or being a member of ASLA or APA, as opposed to being a member of the American Society of Collegiate Schools of Planning. The reward system for faculty members quite often discourages that type of involvement. In fact, on the APA board, we have the chair of the planning department at Berkeley, and he says, well, this of course made all of us feel really good. He says, to my colleagues at Berkeley, my being on the APA board means nothing. Now, if I were in the National Academy of Sciences or something like that, that would be a big deal. So we all sort of looked at him and, mumbled a little bit. So I think that's one problem, is the reward system. That if you want to encourage more practice, you've got to reward practice. The second thing is, of course, I'm a believer in exposing students and faculty to undertaking real-world projects. And I'm not talking about just studio projects, but actually going out, doing community a service, and getting frustrated by it. Having to deal with cranky clients and community planning boards that can't make up their mind or make up their mind and keep changing it. To me, the political science of the design professions is just as interesting as technique.
That's one of the places where you are ahead of a lot of people with the storefront urban design program you've had, and now your work with affordable housing in the community. You are way ahead of a lot of other academic communities that don't get their hands dirty and go out into the community and work with the public.
We have for a number of years been trying to set a model for Miami University and get them to come along with it. Let's, before we move to another question, let me just ask if there are members of our faculty or Dean Fisher or others from Ball State who would like to respond to this issue that we're just talking about here. Professor Lasso.
One of the things that brings up is the difference between all of our academic communities and those of other professions, and that is really a lack of research. Research in the architectural profession is primarily done by manufacturers. They find a product and then their research is, how do we sell that to architects? The greatest thing was pond liners in Europe that we now use for roofing materials here. In our computers, we don't use computers in architectural offices that were designed for architectural offices. We use computers that they came up with, and then they tried to adapt them to architectural practice. We need research to drive the development of programs from the side of what we need for design and technology and practice. We need the research from people who aren't selling the products to find out what products we should be using and what innovative ways they should be dealt with. And that's one terrible thing that we have. We do not have the support for research in the academic community for the architectural profession. And that would be a real strong common ground that would be a very, very big help, I think. One of the things I think you ought to realize is the president of the American Institute of Architects next year is the dean of a school of architecture. And we have 2 or 3 deans on the board, Charlie. 3 out of 40, so out of 33.
Dean Fisher, would you like to comment on that?
Jim's comment regarding the extension of the educational period beyond the 5 years that we have. I've been trying to make this point on various forums to practitioners for some period of time. I'm so pleased to hear that I've received better reception from you than from others. I would like to make one adjustment here real quickly. Not too drastic. Sorry, I lost. May have lost the other point I was going to make. Oh, the research
I'm looking for a student who has a question. Numero uno student.
Well, I have to say that I don't really see in the United States any major difference in town forms coming about in the next 20 years. It's sad to say, but I just don't see any difference in town forms. I think we will see, perhaps colleagues here on the panel will probably talk about this. I think we'll see differences in buildings and how building, at least new buildings, and how buildings are retrofitted in terms of energy systems and information systems. But I just don't see, although I'd like to, I don't see us moving toward town forms as they have in Europe. I think we have made some major mistakes in the design of American cities that will cost us dearly in 50 years when we begin to run low on oil supplies. Town forms that are just simply inefficient and hard to preserve. For the past 4 years, I've gone to Holland, which is sort of my favorite European country, and I see how it is possible to get out of a plane in Amsterdam, walk 50 feet, maybe 100 feet, get on a train, go downtown to The Hague in about a half hour, get on another train and another tram, and get dropped off within a half hour or half a block or so of a hotel. Now, you can't do that in most American cities. Most American cities aren't linked together by high-speed rail transportation. You can't do it affordably. And I think the European countries may have an edge in that respect because they will have a lower energy demand. We just have made terrible mistakes in the United States, I think over the long term, in the design of American cities. Mistakes that will just be virtually impossible to change, impossible without some major program of rebuilding with rail systems. So I hate to sound pessimistic, but I think that's what's going to happen.
You know, I would reiterate that. I think we are really very quickly going in absolutely the wrong direction. If you were to take the development that happens at highway interchanges in Washington, D.C., Tyson's Corners. Ken, where did you take me to on the way out yesterday, Ken England? What was the name of the place you took us to the other day? Yeah, Keystone. You know, if you look at what's happening there and the development of non-human interior and exterior space for economic reasons of taking land and linking it to the car and your ability to get there from the highway, creating spaces that are absolutely atrocious, terrible now and will be worse in the future, depleting the energy and the density that we need to make our cities grow. We in the United States, in almost every city that you go to, have treated all of the natural resources that are there in absolutely the wrong way. We have very few cities in the United States that are divided or sit on a river that use the river. We've always turned our back on it, built highways next to it, railroads next to it. You know, if you go to London, you go to Paris, you go to Florence, the river is a vital part of the city, and the concentration of people, the scale of the city's work, and they've worked for 400 and 500 years. We don't have that. We build for tomorrow and we forget about what happens the day afterward. We have placed such a value on immediate return on economy that we're really in trouble. And I think that the nodes on highway centers are creating a disaster in the future that we can't even tell how bad it's going to be right now. We have to learn to reverse the value of land, and the value of land is much, much higher than we ever place on it now. The value of land now is exploitation and quick resale. Its value is far greater than that, and we have an education of not just the architectural planning and landscape community, but of the entire United States to overcome that. And it's a dismal future, but an unbelievable challenge that if we don't overcome, we're going to create skyscraper deserts.
It's interesting you brought that up. Yesterday before I came, I went and I testified on behalf of APA to a state and local government commission in Ohio, which was holding a series of routine public hearings around the state to find out what the problems, local problems in the state are. And where I live in southwest Ohio, there are a group of government officials who've been trying to get a highway, an east-west highway, built. And they always approach these highways as if we have to have it. The highway is going to be this incredible tool for economic development, and if we don't get this highway in, our big competitor is Kentucky. Kentucky will get whatever businesses are supposed to go there, and one of the people on the panel was saying, oh, you know, it's too bad this highway has been held up because of wetlands. You know, I'm not an environmentalist, he says. He says, I think holding up these highways for 22 years because of wetlands is just awful. And my attitude is, thank God they're wetlands, holding these highways up, because building more highways is not the solution in the United States anymore. I am sort of pleased that we're sort of running up against monetary resource limitations, where people are questioning the need of whether the quality of life is going to be increased by yet another highway. And that attitude hasn't quite hit Ohio yet, but maybe the 20th century the late part of the 20th century will hit Ohio in about 50 years.
Do you want to make? Yes. Okay, good question.
I would like to respond to that, just to the extent that I was asking a couple of department heads recently about the face of the student body coming, whether there was a distinct change between now and perhaps 10 years ago, and they said that it was very much changed, that the students were coming with a major concern for social issues, environmental issues, and as opposed to 10 years ago. And I think that the interest and the level that the student body brings causes the administration to design the curriculum in accordance with those concerns. So ultimately, I think you may not see it happen, but it'll happen for the one who's following you.
In the 60s, I think we thought we had more ability to change things than we really did, and probably didn't make much positive change at all. But I think there's a number of things the students have. Number one, you have an accreditation visit coming up. One of the members of that accreditation panel is supposed to be a student. Having been on a couple of accreditation panels, that student's input into the accreditation visit is extremely important. The president of the Student Society sits nationally, both on the AIA board, and meets with the 5 presidents of ACSA, National Architectural Accrediting Board, and NCAR. And the input is very, very positive, and it is listened to, and it is taken into account all the time. I think in the academic community, the student, being in our profession, in any one of them, your student life never ends. I mean, it's now until you die, and you have to be a sponge for that entire time. The thing you have to learn to do is to put yourself in the right mediums to absorb the right things at the right times, and then you have to learn to squeeze thyself at the right time to make the right things come out. Your responsibility is important. One of the things you ought to find out, that in architectural community in 5 years, there's a lot of time you spend in the architectural school. You better find out how to talk to other people, because when you get out of here, you're not just going to talk to the other people in the office. You have to talk to clients, you have to talk to administrators in government, you have to talk to contractors. You have to know a lot. One of the things we don't have time for in architectural education is enough liberal arts education to make us really conversant and liberally educated when we leave. It's one of the great advantages of people who have the time and the finances to go through a 7-year program. But we don't all have that. So as a student, a lot of the things you have to do are a responsibility to put yourself in more bowls with more things to absorb. And that's not easy at this time of your life. But it's not going to get any easier when you go out. The kind of thing that you learn here, that a 24-hour day is not long enough, particularly in the shred before a project's due. If you're doing architecture right, the design process is never finished, your education is never finished. 24 hours is never going to be enough time in a day if you're doing it right. What you've got to learn to do here is to be a little more efficient, so maybe 23 is enough. But you have to put yourself in the right place at the right time, and that's part of your responsibility to absorb more than is offered in the architectural school. Make sure you get yourself in the place where you can get it. And that's tough, it's not easy.
The best advice I can give you, really 2 points, is number one, first of all, be a noisy consumer. That I think our notion of the student as a sponge, again, I teach part-time, and I take very seriously student evaluations of what I do. I'm constantly revising lectures and presentations because of student comments about my approach. So I think you have an obligation really and your faculty, I think, has an obligation to respond. That if the quality of teaching, the manner of presentation isn't what you were expecting, I'm not saying the grade you get, but I'm simply saying the manner of conveying it to you, you ought to be noisy about it. The second thing is that I think that a great deal of your education, in fact, will come about through internships. And you should, every time you have an opportunity to work in a practical setting and to apply the conceptual and technical skills which you're getting out of your undergraduate education, take that opportunity, because that really will be the most lasting. I look back at my own career, and the most influential thing that ever occurred to me was working one summer for the city of Cleveland, because it was like a lesson in political science, and it disabused me of a lot of cherished but foolish notions that I held about city planning, some of which you heard me talk about earlier today. So if you get an opportunity to work in a practical setting, even if it's for free, do it.
I think one of the important things that Stuart just said is education is interactive. You can't just be a sponge. You really have to interact in order to get the most out of what you're doing. You can't always just go into a lecture room and sit down and listen. That doesn't work. You have to interact both with the faculty and you have to interact with other resources that are available in the community.
I'll share 2 points with the panel about our student body. This student body is a noisy group of consumers and students. And secondly, I think the point about the 24 hours is important because our students, when they leave here, will need to learn that most clients operate from 8 to 5 because this group operates mainly from 10 p.m. until 4 a.m.
I operate from 9 a.m. till about 1 a.m.
Well,
I like it. Okay, this was the live one. When I look back at my planning my planning education, there was almost no emphasis on management skills, which is what I was trying to get at. That often those people who practice architecture probably know that producing something on time and in budget is quite as often as important to a client as producing a brilliant award-winning design. We had I'd say we had the same problem when I was in planning school, that our faculty members seem to skim over the need to organize yourself to produce something on time and meeting whatever the design objective is. I mean, a good example is, you know, the student comes in and they give you this routine about, you know, the dog ate it, or, you know, something like that. You know, I've heard them all, dead grandmothers, that sort of thing. And I think you got to be pretty hard-boiled about it, number one. And number two, I do think you have to spend time as faculty members explaining how to organize yourself, how to get people to work in group settings, which I think is really what we're all finding ourselves in. You know, we have, my city hires architects to come in and do design work for us, and it's a real skill to come in and take a department head and figure out what his need is. You know, the old style would be that the architect would come in and sort of measure the room and tell you you can only have, you know, 150 square feet. Now we don't see that anymore, and that's a skill that has got to be developed. So I think maybe it doesn't come from the architecture faculty itself, but someplace along the line, those skills have got to be developed somewhere along the line.
Yeah, I would say those skills are communication skills, and communication is not just talking, but it's listening. It's learning how to absorb information and how to prioritize that information, organize that information, but it's also how to communicate verbally and in the written word. One of the things that you find when you get out is you really have to explain things. You have to communicate to people your ideas. You have to become an educator to educate clients on what they really need to resolve their program. You have to listen to know what that program was in the very first place before you can go any further than that. And frequently what happens in architectural school is you do a design and a charrette in a couple of weeks, and you get up and you rationalize that design. You don't explain what you've done, you don't explain how you meet the program, but you are almost rewarded for using paradigm dichotomy and pedagogy in rationalizing your design in front of the jury. You have to, if your design works and meets the programmatic needs that you have, you should be able to explain it very clearly and communicate the solution. And the solution in your drawing should also communicate without you there, if it's a strong enough concept. So I think communication, which is the same thing in working in groups, it is the ability to communicate one-on-one, the ability to communicate in groups, both listening and oral.
I think some of the problem that you addressed, Noel, could be handled through a more intense internship type program. And I think maybe that can't be underemphasized, because the students, I'm sure, must come back if they've had an opportunity, for example, a year's internship in an office. They must come back with a different perspective, and that's probably the kinds of things that you're not able to communicate to them as educators. One thing that I notice just now, since I have just taken on 2 people from a large office to my small office, and something that I don't know how a university can deal with is the approach to problems is totally different in a small office where things are coming and turning over very rapidly. You have to work very fast, whereas the large office is more like well, I don't know whether you have very short-term projects, but I see the students working in a manner which I might have expected them to do in a university situation, and they're not really prepared for that fast turnover type thinking.
Professor Sabenfield? Want to accept that challenge, or just nod? Done. And they're writing it down. I think we have time for one more question and comment. Anyone up here in the balcony? No. Yes.
No, I think they should, and not only for the institution's benefit, but quite frankly for the practitioner's benefit. I think both parties benefit. I think there are programs across the country. There are co-op programs where people, interrupt their studies for a year, which are very successful. There are places like the BAC in Boston, where I was fortunate enough to be on the accreditation board. 125 volunteer design professionals from the community who come in and teach, and the only thing they get paid for is their parking. But 125 of them. And in that particular institution, where all the students only go to school from 5 to 10 at night, it takes them 7 to 9 years to get through a normal program that you'd take 5 through, and are required to work 40 hours a day in an architectural office. You find a very, very different kind of result. Not the kind of result you find it takes a long time for design to mature in that kind of an extreme. So that extreme, I think, is really an extreme, and we shouldn't be that far off. But I think there are places in between where practitioners can come in from the community to be on juries, to bring in and talk about real programs, to act as clients, and real clients should come in. Somebody from the local hospital, if there's a program going on for, in addition to the hospital, for operating suites, to have the real clients, the head nurse from the operating suite and the head surgeon to come in and sit down and talk about the criteria for a program. Those kinds of things can really be a help, I think, in a community. I think that's an excellent example of Caesar's office. Caesar's office is a little different. They don't do working drawings. I mean, it's a design office, and it's a very different kind of community. But that kind of thing is something that definitely should be pushed into professional. There's a fellow who used to work at HOK, who is now, he was a vice president with AI. Where is Gregory now? Yeah. Every week he sits down and he does a seminar within the office. Very much like you would do a seminar in a course that would be continuing adult education at a large university in a graduate level program, talking about either slides of different cities or different buildings they analyze. In our office, we get together and sometimes do design problems where we will put up several solutions and just break out a couple 6-packs of beer and sit there for the afternoon going over those. We invite other offices into our office for lunch and to discuss things that we have on the boards, which doesn't happen in a lot of the architectural community because of kind of the territorial thing. You know, we're all very proud of what we've done and we submit it for awards and we hope we get published. But for some reason, once it's on the board, we're all very protective and don't want people to see it. Well, that's probably the time that we could have the greatest interchange of information about it, the greatest discussion, and make ourselves grow and the projects come out better if we did it at that time. So there are some barriers that need to be broken down, but I think the continuing of those kinds of things and those kinds of intellectual discussions, sharing of slides from trips, discussion or analyzing of awards programs, or discussing even almost a book, you know, reviewing books that individuals read in the office over lunch, is the kind of thing that would be a terrific thing to spread around. How we spread that through the profession, we'll have to think about, but I think it's a great idea. Otherwise, we're kind of a dead-end thing.
I suppose I have another response to that, is this, that at least the planning profession, because it's so involved with public regulation and public investment, and it is always dealing with new public officials who have no idea where it came from and no idea where it's going, who basically come to the governmental arena with a set of values, which may be good values, they may be bad values, they may be different values. My association has spent a lot of time developing through its chapters, we have 45 of them, training programs for elected and appointed officials. That's been the big thrust. We're pretty well trained ourselves. We do a good job of training ourselves, but we feel the really missed dimension and where American city planning sort of went wrong was ignoring the people who were our clients, training them, and maybe not with the same level of detail. I think to some degree that that has affected American architecture. That you know, I process building and zoning permits, of hiring an architect because they think they're going to get some egomaniac who's going to boss them around. And I'm not sure that the architecture profession has done the best job it could in educating the American public about why they need architects, and why an architect is really your best, most cost-effective way of solving a problem. I happen to believe that the case. I would always hire an architect, and that's not simply because I came out of a design background. I just feel architects know what they're doing. It's not like hiring a draftsman who may never have had any design work in the past. I think that an educational responsibility of the architecture community, whether it be the academic community or the professional community, maybe the academic community, would be to make architecture less frightening and more warm and cozy to the American public, so more people will use architects. Most of the homes that are built in my community are not designed by architects. They're picked out of plan books or designed by some draftsman in some home builder's office. As a result, you get a lot of mediocre stuff. I mean, things that are basically undistinguished. And I think that in part that's because of the forbidding nature of the architecture profession to many Americans.
I think that's very true. On my own part, I personally go out and try to hug people on the street daily and let them know I'm an architect, but it isn't working real well. But that's part of the education of the public. And one of the things that I think Stuart brought up that's really important is a lot of people think of architects as ego-driven design maniacs, and that's not where design should come from. Design should come from the sensitive resolution of problems that adds to the quality of our environment. And that is not a personal expression of getting the front cover of one of the magazines. It is responding properly to the program and being a good listener, and it doesn't mean that your design should be mundane. It means the design should move forward and be better than the last that you've done, and should respond to all the problems. But it means it has to take everything into account. And that's part of the education all of us have to do with every client. We don't lead direct a client. We educate and involve ourselves and get educated by the client in the process. And I think that's part of the attitude that we have to overcome in ourselves before we can overcome the attitudes of the public and the consumers.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our symposium. I want to thank our distinguished panel, James Lawler, Claire Bennett, and Stuart Meck, and thank all of you for joining in. And I'm turning it back now to Dean Fisher, I gather. Yes.
I have 2 or 3 things to do here. The first thing is to, I on numerous occasions have the opportunity to say how proud I am to be the dean of a college that contains architects, landscape architects, and planners, because for one reason, they're all wonderfully bright, creative, articulate, and interesting people. I think if anybody has reason to doubt that statement, all I would have to do would be to show them the tape of this panel today. I can't think of a superlative that would be extravagant enough to compliment you on the discussion today. I think the people, our alumni firms, a number of whom have our alumni as principals or owners in the firm, all of them, as a matter of fact, would be very proud if they were here today. Some of them are. I've seen some people who are in the firms who contributed funds to the support of this symposium. I should recognize those people certainly. The 6 firms are Abel Ringham Architects of Indianapolis, Boyd Sobray Associates Incorporated of Indianapolis, Browning Day Mullins and Deerdorf Incorporated of Indianapolis and Louisville, Covert Hawkins Armstrong Architects of Jeffersonville, MSKTD and Associates, Fort Wayne,